Sometimes the cruelest betrayals come wrapped in love, and the dead refuse to stay buried when justice demands the truth. I'm Eleanor, and for decades I've been the keeper of letters that hold secrets powerful enough to shatter lives and rebuild souls. 2 weeks ago, while cataloging estate documents at the Charleston Historical Society, I discovered a hidden compartment in an antique writing desk that contained something extraordinary: the private correspondence of Isabella Montgomery, a woman whose family's greed cost her everything she held dear, and whose determination to uncover the truth would expose a conspiracy so shocking it would rock Charleston society to its very foundation. This is the story of a young heiress who was told her beloved had died in battle, who mourned him for 3 agonizing years, only to discover he had been very much alive, paid by her own family to disappear forever. But love has a way of refusing to stay buried, and truth has a power that no amount of money can silence. Have you ever discovered that people you trusted with your life were the very ones plotting to destroy your happiness? Share your story in the comments, because Isabella's journey will show you that sometimes our greatest enemy sleeps under our own roof, and our most powerful weapon is the courage to face the unthinkable truth. Charleston, South Carolina, in the sweltering summer of 1838, was a city where Spanish moss draped ancient oak trees like mourning veils, where grand plantation houses stood as monuments to wealth built on the backs of enslaved labor, and where the most prominent families guarded their fortunes and reputations with a fierceness that could destroy anyone who threatened their carefully constructed world of privilege and power. Isabella Montgomery stood on the wraparound veranda of her family's magnificent estate on Meeting Street, watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across manicured gardens that had once brought her joy but now seemed as lifeless as the heart that beat hollowly in her chest. At 24 years old, Isabella possessed the kind of haunting beauty that comes from great sorrow: dark hair that she now wore pulled back in severe styles, green eyes that had lost their sparkle since receiving news that had shattered her world, and a grace that moved through rooms like a ghost of the vibrant young woman she had been before tragedy claimed her future and left her with nothing but memories and tears. The Montgomery family had built their enormous wealth through rice plantations that stretched across the Low Country, through investments in cotton that connected them to markets from New York to London, and through shipping interests that made their name respected in every major port along the Atlantic coast, creating a dynasty that commanded both fear and admiration throughout the South. Isabella's father, Judge William Montgomery, wielded influence that extended far beyond his courtroom, shaping laws and policies that protected the interests of the planter class while maintaining the social order that kept families like his firmly entrenched at the pinnacle of Southern society. Her mother, Charlotte Montgomery, descended from one of Charleston's oldest families, possessed social connections that could make or break reputations with a single whispered conversation at the right dinner party or charity function. Isabella had been raised with every privilege that immense wealth could provide, educated by the finest tutors, surrounded by luxury that most people could never imagine, and groomed to take her place among Charleston's social elite through marriage to someone deemed worthy of joining the Montgomery legacy. But Isabella's heart had chosen a path that horrified her parents and threatened everything they had spent generations building. She had fallen deeply, passionately in love with Captain Thomas Harrison, a young Army officer whose courage on the battlefield had earned him respect and rapid promotion, but whose modest family background and lack of inherited wealth made him completely unsuitable as a husband for a Montgomery heiress in the eyes of her parents. Thomas Harrison was everything that Isabella's parents feared in a potential son-in-law: intelligent enough to see through their manipulation, principled enough to refuse their bribes, and compelling enough to win their daughter's heart so completely that no amount of parental pressure could shake her determination to marry him despite their furious objections. Thomas came from a respectable but not wealthy family in Virginia, had earned his military commission through merit rather than purchase, and possessed the kind of honest character that made him beloved by his men and respected by his superiors, but also made him dangerous to families who maintained their power through secrets, deception, and the careful manipulation of people who trusted them. His love for Isabella was genuine and absolute, unmarred by any interest in her inheritance or social position, which only made him more threatening to parents who could not understand or control a relationship based on authentic emotion rather than calculated advantage. The romance between Isabella and Thomas had blossomed during the spring of 1835, when he was stationed in Charleston and she encountered him at a military ceremony honoring officers who had distinguished themselves in conflicts with Native American tribes along the frontier. Isabella had been immediately drawn to Thomas's quiet confidence, his genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions rather than just her beauty and family connections, and his complete lack of the calculating charm that characterized most of the men her parents had tried to push into her life. Thomas, for his part, found in Isabella not just extraordinary beauty but a quick intelligence, a kind heart, and a spirit that had somehow remained genuine despite being raised in an environment where authenticity was often sacrificed for social advantage. Their courtship had unfolded against the backdrop of her parents' growing alarm and increasingly desperate attempts to end a relationship they viewed as a threat to everything they held dear. Judge Montgomery had tried reasoning with Isabella, explaining how marriage to Thomas would diminish her social position and limit her future in ways she was too young and naive to understand. When reason failed, he had attempted bribery, offering Thomas increasingly large sums of money to leave Charleston and end his relationship with Isabella. When bribery proved ineffective, Judge Montgomery had turned to threats, using his extensive network of political and business connections to damage Thomas's military career and create obstacles that might force him to choose between his love for Isabella and his professional advancement. Charlotte Montgomery had employed more subtle tactics, organizing social events designed to introduce Isabella to wealthy young men from appropriate families, spreading carefully crafted rumors about Thomas's background and motivations, and using her influence with other Charleston matrons to create social pressure that might convince Isabella to reconsider a relationship that was already causing whispers and raised eyebrows among the families whose opinions mattered most to the Montgomery. Social position. But Isabella's love for Thomas had proven stronger than her parents' manipulation, and her determination to marry him despite their objections had only grown firmer as she witnessed the lengths to which they would go to destroy her happiness for the sake of their own priorities. The crisis had reached its breaking point in the autumn of 1835, when Thomas received orders for a military assignment that would take him to remote frontier outposts where communication would be difficult and dangerous. An assignment that Judge Montgomery had quietly arranged through his political connections as a way to separate the young couple and give Isabella time to forget her inappropriate attachment while Thomas was confronting the harsh realities of military life far from Charleston's comfortable society. Thomas and Isabella had planned to marry before his departure, understanding that their marriage would present her parents with a fait accompli they would be forced to accept rather than continue fighting. But their wedding plans had been disrupted when Thomas received urgent orders to depart immediately for what his commanding officers described as a critical mission requiring his specialized knowledge of frontier conditions and Native American negotiations. Isabella's last conversation with Thomas had taken place on a moonlit evening in her family's garden, where ancient camellias bloomed white in the darkness and the sound of distant church bells marked time that was slipping away too quickly for lovers who knew they might not see each other again for months or even years. Thomas had held her close, promising that no distance could diminish his love, that no danger could prevent his return to claim her as his wife, and that no force on earth could keep them apart permanently if she would only wait for him and trust in their future together. Isabella had pledged her heart to him completely, promising to resist any pressure from her parents to marry someone else, to wait for his return no matter how long it might take, and to preserve their love against all obstacles until they could finally be united in the marriage they both desired more than anything else in the world. "Isabella, my beloved," Thomas had whispered as he prepared to leave for what they both hoped would be a brief separation, "remember that my heart carries you with me wherever duty may take me, and that no earthly power can separate souls that have been joined by love as true as ours. Wait for me, trust in our future, and know that every sunrise brings me one day closer to the moment when I can make you my wife and begin the life we have dreamed of together." Isabella had treasured these words during the long months that followed, clinging to them when her parents' pressure became unbearable and when the silence from Thomas stretched longer than either of them had anticipated when they said their farewells. The months following Thomas's departure had been a test of Isabella's faith and determination that pushed her to the limits of her emotional endurance while her parents intensified their campaign to convince her that her attachment to Thomas was a foolish mistake that would ruin her life if she did not abandon it in favor of more practical considerations. Judge Montgomery had arranged introductions to wealthy young men from prominent families, each presenting different advantages that he claimed would provide Isabella with security, social position, and happiness that a marriage to Thomas could never offer. Charlotte Montgomery had organized elaborate social events designed to distract Isabella from her longing for Thomas while demonstrating the pleasures and privileges she would sacrifice if she persisted in her determination to marry beneath her station. But Isabella had remained steadfast in her love and loyalty, rejecting every suitor her parents presented and refusing to consider any future that did not include Thomas as her husband, even as the months of separation stretched longer than anyone had expected and communications from him became increasingly rare and then stopped altogether. Isabella's faith in Thomas's love and his promise to return had sustained her through periods of doubt and loneliness that might have weakened someone with less absolute commitment to the relationship they had pledged to preserve despite all obstacles and opposition. The devastating news that would shatter Isabella's world had arrived on a humid August morning in 1836. Delivered by a military messenger whose solemn expression and formal manner immediately conveyed the tragedy he had come to report. Colonel James Patterson, Thomas's commanding officer, had written to inform Judge Montgomery that Captain Thomas Harrison had been killed in action during a confrontation with hostile Native American forces, dying courageously in the performance of his duty while protecting settlers on the dangerous frontier where few soldiers survived long enough to return home to the families and sweethearts they had left behind in more civilized parts of the country. The letter had described Thomas's death in terms that emphasized his bravery and dedication to duty, explaining that he had volunteered for a particularly dangerous reconnaissance mission because his knowledge of the terrain and his rapport with friendly tribes made him the best qualified officer for the assignment, despite the obvious risks involved. Colonel Patterson had written that Thomas's final words had been of Isabella, that he had died carrying her photograph and a letter he had been writing to her, and that his fellow officers wished to convey their respect for a man whose courage in battle was matched only by his devotion to the woman he had hoped to marry when his military service allowed him to return to Charleston and claim his bride. Isabella's reaction to news of Thomas's death had been a grief so profound and devastating that it had frightened her parents, who had expected her to mourn appropriately but then recover and move forward with a more suitable marriage that would restore harmony to the family and secure her future in ways that marriage to Thomas never could have accomplished. Instead, Isabella had retreated into a sorrow so deep and complete that she seemed to lose interest in everything that had once brought her joy, refusing to participate in social activities, declining to consider any of the suitors who continued to seek her hand, and spending hours each day writing letters to Thomas that she would never send and reading his letters to her that she treasured as the only remaining connection to the love that had been stolen from her by death. Isabella's mourning had extended far beyond what Charleston society considered appropriate for a woman grieving a man who had never officially become her fiancé, creating embarrassment for her parents and concern among their friends who wondered whether Isabella's excessive attachment to Thomas's memory indicated an unhealthy fixation that would prevent her from ever making the advantageous marriage her family needed to maintain their social position and secure their future. Charlotte Montgomery had consulted physicians and ministers who had offered various theories about Isabella's prolonged grief and recommendations for treatments that might help her overcome what they viewed as an unnatural attachment to the dead that was preventing her from embracing life and love among the living. But Isabella's grief had been both genuine and rational, rooted not in fantasy or unhealthy obsession but in the absolute certainty that she had lost the only man she could ever love completely and that no future marriage could ever provide the happiness and fulfillment she had experienced during her brief time with Thomas. She had understood that her parents viewed her mourning as excessive and inconvenient, but she had also known that their inability to comprehend the depth of her loss reflected their own failure to understand what genuine love meant when it was not compromised by calculations of social advantage and financial benefit. For 3 years, Isabella had lived in a kind of suspended animation, going through the motions of daily life while feeling as though the essential part of herself had died with Thomas and been buried in some unmarked grave on a distant frontier where she would never be able to visit or leave flowers to honor his memory. She had maintained the outward forms of social participation to prevent her parents from taking more drastic measures to force her recovery, but her heart had remained frozen in the moment when she received news of Thomas's death, unable to move forward into a future that held no possibility of the happiness she had once taken for granted. The Montgomery family's patience with Isabella's prolonged mourning had gradually transformed into frustration and then determination to take whatever steps might be necessary to restore their daughter to a normal life that included marriage to an appropriate husband who could strengthen their family's position while providing Isabella with the security and social standing she would need as she aged beyond the prime years when her beauty and inheritance made her a desirable bride. By the spring of 1839, Judge Montgomery had begun making increasingly direct statements about his expectation that Isabella would end her mourning period and begin considering marriage proposals from the several wealthy young men who remained interested in winning her hand despite her reputation for excessive attachment to the memory of an unsuitable lover. The confrontation that would change everything had occurred on a warm May afternoon when Isabella's world collided with a reality so shocking that it would shatter every assumption she had made about her life, her family, and the tragedy that had defined her existence for the past 3 years, replacing certainty with questions that demanded answers her parents had spent years ensuring she would never discover. Isabella had been walking through Charleston's busy market district, accompanied by her maid on one of her rare ventures outside the family estate, when she had seen a face that stopped her heart and made her question her own sanity. Standing across the crowded marketplace, examining goods at a merchant's stall, was a man whose profile and bearing were so familiar that Isabella felt the world tilt beneath her feet even as her rational mind insisted that what she was seeing was impossible, that grief had finally driven her to the kind of hallucinations that physicians had warned might result from prolonged mourning and emotional strain. But as she watched, the man had turned slightly, revealing features that were unmistakably those of Thomas Harrison, older and changed by years that had carved lines around his eyes and added gray to his hair, but indisputably the face of the man she had loved and mourned and believed dead for 3 devastating years. The shock of seeing Thomas alive had been so profound that Isabella had nearly fainted on the spot, saved only by her maid's quick thinking and steady arm as they retreated to a nearby carriage where Isabella could recover from the emotional impact of a discovery that challenged everything she thought she knew about loss, grief, and the reliability of information she had received from sources she had never thought to question. The rational part of Isabella's mind had immediately begun generating explanations for what she had witnessed: mistaken identity, resemblance between strangers, the effects of longing and grief on perception, but her heart had recognized Thomas with a certainty that transcended rational analysis and demanded investigation regardless of the consequences or complications that might result. Isabella's first instinct had been to approach the man immediately, to call Thomas's name and confirm whether the impossible was true or whether her grief-stricken mind had finally begun playing cruel tricks that would add madness to the burden of sorrow she had carried for so long. But caution and the magnitude of the implications had held her back, making her realize that if Thomas was indeed alive, then everything she had been told about his death was a lie, and lies of such magnitude were not accidental mistakes but deliberate deceptions that suggested conspiracies involving people she had trusted completely and betrayals that went to the heart of everything she had believed about her family and her life. The decision to investigate rather than confront had required Isabella to develop skills in deception and secrecy that were completely foreign to her nature but absolutely necessary if she was to discover the truth without alerting anyone who might have reasons to prevent her from learning facts that had been hidden from her for years. Isabella had begun making excuses for trips into Charleston, always accompanied by servants who could be trusted to keep her activities private, slowly gathering information about the man she had seen and trying to determine whether he was indeed Thomas Harrison or simply someone whose resemblance had triggered false hope in a heart desperate for any possibility that the man she loved might still be alive. The investigation had required weeks of patient observation, careful questioning of merchants and residents who might have information about the mysterious man's identity and activities, and gradual accumulation of evidence that supported the impossible conclusion that Thomas Harrison was not only alive but living in Charleston under a different name, working as a clerk for a shipping company, and apparently unaware that the woman he had once loved was living less than 5 miles away from his modest boarding house near the harbor. Isabella had learned that the man was known as William Thompson, that he had arrived in Charleston approximately 3 years earlier, and that he lived quietly and simply, avoiding the social activities and public venues where he might have encountered people from his past life or attracted attention that could have led to uncomfortable questions about his background and previous experiences. The more Isabella had learned about William Thompson's life and circumstances, the more convinced she had become that he was indeed Thomas Harrison, changed by whatever experiences had transformed him from a confident young military officer into a reserved and solitary clerk who seemed to be hiding from something or someone that made him wary of drawing attention to himself or forming connections that might expose secrets he was determined to protect. Isabella had observed him from a distance on multiple occasions, noting gestures and expressions that were heartbreakingly familiar, mannerisms that no amount of disguise or deception could completely alter, and a sadness in his bearing that suggested he too was living with losses and regrets that had changed the fundamental nature of his existence. The breakthrough in Isabella's investigation had come when she had managed to observe William Thompson's handwriting on a shipping manifest, recognizing immediately the familiar script that had penned the love letters she had treasured and reread countless times during the 3 years she had believed him dead. The handwriting was unmistakably Thomas's, providing the final piece of evidence Isabella needed to confirm that the man living quietly under an assumed name was indeed her lost love, transformed by circumstances she did not yet understand but undeniably alive and present in a city where she had mourned his death while he lived unknown and unrecognized by anyone from his former life. The confirmation that Thomas was alive had filled Isabella with a mixture of joy, relief, confusion, and growing anger as she began to understand that his survival meant that someone had deliberately lied to her about his death, that her 3 years of grief and mourning had been based on false information provided by people who had reasons for wanting her to believe that Thomas was dead and that any future for them was impossible. The realization that she had been deceived about something so fundamental and devastating had forced Isabella to question everything she had believed about her family, their motives, and their willingness to sacrifice her happiness for their own purposes and priorities. The confrontation with Thomas had required careful planning and absolute secrecy, as Isabella had understood that their reunion must occur without alerting her family or anyone else who might have been involved in the conspiracy that had kept them apart for 3 years while she mourned a death that had never occurred. Isabella had arranged to encounter William Thompson at his boarding house during an evening when her absence from home could be explained by a fictional social obligation, bringing with her one of Thomas's letters as proof of their shared past and evidence that his true identity was known to someone who had once meant everything to him. The moment of recognition when Thomas had seen Isabella standing in the doorway of his modest room had been overwhelming for both of them, confirming beyond any doubt that their love had survived years of separation and deception, but also raising questions about how his disappearance had been arranged and who had been responsible for the lies that had kept them apart while she grieved and he lived in exile from everything and everyone he had once cherished. Thomas's first words had been her name, spoken with a mixture of disbelief, joy, and fear that revealed both his unchanged love for her and his awareness that their reunion was dangerous for reasons she did not yet fully understand. "Isabella," Thomas had whispered, as though speaking her name too loudly might shatter the moment or alert enemies who could separate them again. "You're here, you're real, but how is this possible? They told me you were dead, that you had died of fever while I was away, that there was nothing left for me in Charleston but grief and memories that would destroy me if I stayed to mourn what could never be recovered." The revelation that Thomas had been told Isabella was dead, just as she had been told he was dead, had immediately confirmed that their separation had been the result of deliberate deception rather than tragic accident, but it had also raised new questions about who had orchestrated such elaborate lies and what they had hoped to accomplish by destroying 2 lives through systematic betrayal and manipulation. Isabella had shared her own story of being told that Thomas had died in battle, of 3 years spent mourning a loss that had never actually occurred, and of the investigation that had led her to discover his survival and his new identity as William Thompson. Their reunion had been both joyful and painful, as they had realized that their love had remained strong despite years of separation and lies, but that they had both been victims of a conspiracy designed to destroy their relationship while protecting interests that had been deemed more important than their happiness or their right to choose their own futures. The task of uncovering the full truth about who had orchestrated their separation and why had required Isabella and Thomas to work together in ways that tested both their love and their courage, as they had gradually realized that the conspiracy against them had involved people Isabella trusted completely and had been motivated by considerations that revealed the extent to which her family was willing to sacrifice her well-being for their own purposes. The investigation had been dangerous because it had threatened to expose people with power and resources to protect themselves, but it had also been necessary because Isabella and Thomas had understood that their future together depended on revealing the truth and ensuring that those responsible for years of unnecessary suffering faced consequences for the betrayal they had committed. Have you ever felt like everything you believed about the people closest to you was built on lies? Isabella's world was about to crumble in ways she never could have imagined. But sometimes the most painful truths are also the most liberating. Her courage to keep searching for answers, even when those answers might destroy everything she thought she knew about her family, shows us that love demands honesty, even when honesty comes at the highest price. If you've ever had to choose between comfortable lies and painful truths, I'd love to hear about your experience in the comments. Your stories help me understand why these tales of courage and betrayal continue to resonate with us across the centuries. The evidence that Isabella and Thomas uncovered about the conspiracy against them had been more extensive and damaging than either had initially imagined, revealing not just a simple attempt to separate two lovers but a complex web of bribery, deception, and manipulation that had involved multiple people in positions of trust and authority who had been willing to destroy lives in service of protecting the Montgomery family's wealth and social position from what they perceived as an unacceptable threat. Judge Montgomery had used his political connections to arrange for Thomas's reassignment to dangerous frontier duty where death would be likely. But when Thomas had survived the assignment and shown signs of returning to Charleston to claim Isabella as his bride, more drastic measures had been deemed necessary to permanently end their relationship. The crucial meeting that had sealed Thomas's fate had taken place in Judge Montgomery's private study during the winter of 1835. Where Isabella's father had presented Thomas with an ultimatum that was designed to appear as a generous offer but was actually a sophisticated form of blackmail that gave Thomas no real choice except to comply with demands that would destroy his future with Isabella while protecting the Montgomery family from the embarrassment and financial implications of their daughter marrying beneath her station. Judge Montgomery had offered Thomas $20,000 in gold, a fortune that represented more money than most men earned in a lifetime, in exchange for his permanent departure from Charleston and his agreement to never contact Isabella again or reveal his survival to anyone who might inform her that he was still alive. Captain Harrison, Judge Montgomery had said with the cold authority of a man accustomed to having his will enforced regardless of the cost to other people's lives and happiness, "You will accept this generous compensation for the inconvenience of ending your relationship with my daughter, or you will face criminal charges for theft of military property, desertion from your post, and conduct unbecoming an officer that will result in court-martial, imprisonment, and disgrace that will destroy not only your career but your reputation and any possibility of future employment in civilian life." The charges Judge Montgomery had threatened were completely fabricated, but they had been supported by falsified documents and perjured testimony from witnesses who owed their own positions and prosperity to his influence and who could be counted upon to provide whatever evidence might be needed to destroy someone who threatened his interests. Thomas's initial refusal to accept the bribe had been met with escalating threats that had made it clear Judge Montgomery was prepared to use every resource at his disposal to destroy Thomas's life if he did not voluntarily disappear and allow Isabella to believe he was dead, creating the emotional devastation that would make her vulnerable to pressure to marry someone more appropriate to her social station and family obligations. The threats had included not only criminal prosecution but also economic warfare that would destroy Thomas's family's modest but respectable business interests in Virginia, social ostracism that would make it impossible for him to find employment in any profession that required reputation and references, and even physical violence that could be arranged through Judge Montgomery's connections with less reputable individuals who were willing to handle problems that could not be solved through legal or financial pressure alone. The sophistication of the psychological manipulation that had been employed against both Thomas and Isabella had been revealed through correspondence that Thomas had discovered hidden in Judge Montgomery's private papers, letters that detailed strategies for convincing each lover that the other was dead while ensuring that neither would ever learn the truth about the deception that had been practiced against them. Colonel Patterson, the military officer who had written to inform Judge Montgomery of Thomas's supposed death in battle, had been a long-time associate whose own career and financial security depended on Judge Montgomery's continued support, making him willing to provide false testimony about events that had never occurred in exchange for benefits that would secure his family's future and his own advancement in military hierarchy. The letter that had informed Isabella of Thomas's death had been crafted with careful attention to details that would make the story believable while including enough tragedy and heroism to prevent her from investigating further or questioning the accuracy of information that came from sources she trusted completely. Colonel Patterson had described Thomas's final battle in terms that emphasized both his courage and the hopelessness of his situation, creating a narrative that honored his memory while explaining why no body had been recovered and why no personal effects except a water-damaged letter could be returned to his bereaved family and friends. Simultaneously, Thomas had received fabricated news of Isabella's death from fever, supported by forged letters and false testimony from people he had trusted to provide accurate information about events in Charleston during his military service on the frontier. The story of Isabella's illness and death had been designed to devastate Thomas while also explaining why he should not return to Charleston, where his presence might raise uncomfortable questions about his survival and his relationship with the Montgomery family daughter whose death had been invented to ensure his compliance with Judge Montgomery's demands. The discovery that both had been told the other was dead had revealed the cruel sophistication of a conspiracy that had been designed not just to separate them but to ensure that neither would ever seek to re-establish contact or investigate the circumstances of their supposed loss, creating parallel tragedies that had kept them apart while each mourned a death that existed only in the lies they had been told by people who claimed to have their best interests at heart. The emotional devastation that had resulted from these lies had been precisely what Judge Montgomery had calculated would be necessary to achieve his goals while avoiding the direct confrontation that might have exposed his methods and motivated resistance that could have threatened his carefully laid plans. The evidence of Judge Montgomery's involvement in orchestrating their separation had been accompanied by proof that Charlotte Montgomery had been equally complicit in the conspiracy, using her social connections and influence to spread stories that would support the false narrative of Thomas's death while simultaneously working to convince Isabella that her prolonged mourning was unhealthy and that her best path to recovery lay in marriage to one of the wealthy and socially prominent men who continued to seek her hand despite her reputation for excessive attachment to an inappropriate lover's memory. Charlotte Montgomery's letters revealed her belief that the deception had been necessary to protect Isabella from a marriage that would have diminished her social position and limited her opportunities for the kind of life she deserved as a member of one of Charleston's most prominent families. The financial aspects of the conspiracy had been even more extensive than the emotional manipulation, involving not only the $20,000 that had been paid to Thomas to ensure his departure from Charleston but also additional payments to Colonel Patterson, various military officials, and other individuals whose cooperation had been necessary to maintain the fiction of Thomas's death over the 3 years during which Isabella had mourned while he lived in exile from everything he had once held dear. Judge Montgomery's financial records revealed that the total cost of separating Isabella from Thomas had exceeded $40,000, a sum that represented a significant portion of the family's annual income but which had been justified as a necessary investment in protecting their dynasty from the long-term costs of allowing their daughter to marry someone who would not contribute to the family's wealth and social position. The records also revealed that Judge Montgomery had been negotiating with several wealthy families whose sons were seeking wives with substantial dowries and impeccable social connections, arranging marriage agreements that would have provided substantial financial benefits to the Montgomery family while ensuring that Isabella's inheritance would remain within the closed circle of Charleston's planter elite rather than being diminished by marriage to someone whose loyalty and discretion could not be guaranteed. The discovery of these negotiations had made it clear that Isabella's happiness and preferences had never been considered relevant to plans for her future, which had been determined entirely by calculations of financial advantage and social positioning that treated her as a valuable asset to be managed rather than as a person with rights and desires that deserved respect and consideration. The psychological manipulation that had been employed to maintain the deception had been particularly cruel in its exploitation of both Isabella's grief and Thomas's love for her, using their most powerful emotions as weapons against them while ensuring that their separation would be maintained through their own voluntary compliance rather than through continued coercion that might have created opportunities for resistance or exposure. Isabella had been encouraged to write letters to Thomas that were never sent, maintaining her connection to his memory while preventing any communication that could have revealed his survival, while Thomas had been discouraged from any contact with Charleston through stories about Isabella's death and warnings about the dangers of returning to a city where his presence could create problems for people who had helped him during his military service. The elaborate nature of the conspiracy had required the cooperation of numerous individuals who had been willing to participate in destroying two lives in exchange for personal benefits that ranged from direct financial payments to promises of future advancement and protection from Judge Montgomery's considerable influence in business and political circles. The conspiracy had succeeded for 3 years because it had been supported by people in positions of authority whose word was not questioned and because both Isabella and Thomas had trusted sources of information that seemed reliable and had no apparent motivation to deceive them about matters of such fundamental importance to their lives and future happiness. The evidence of the conspiracy's extent and sophistication had been overwhelming, but it had also created new challenges for Isabella and Thomas as they had realized that exposing the truth would require confronting powerful people who had significant resources to protect themselves and who could be expected to fight back against accusations that threatened to destroy their reputations and positions. The decision to seek justice rather than simply accepting their reunion as sufficient compensation for years of unnecessary suffering had required both of them to accept risks that went beyond personal danger to include threats against family members and associates who could be made to suffer for their decision to challenge people with the power to retaliate in ways that extended far beyond the original victims of the conspiracy. The strategy for exposing Judge Montgomery's crimes had been developed carefully to maximize the chances of success while minimizing the opportunities for retaliation and cover-up that could have allowed the guilty parties to escape consequences while ensuring that Isabella and Thomas faced punishment for threatening the established order that protected families like the Montgomerys from accountability for their actions. Isabella and Thomas had understood that their success would depend not only on the strength of their evidence but also on their ability to present their case in ways that would generate public sympathy and support from people who possessed the influence needed to ensure that justice was achieved despite the social and political obstacles they would face. The first step in their campaign for justice had been to secure the original documents that proved Judge Montgomery's involvement in the conspiracy, including letters, financial records, and correspondence with accomplices who had participated in maintaining the deception over the years. It had been necessary to keep Isabella and Thomas apart while protecting the family's interests from the threat their relationship had represented. Isabella had used her access to her father's private study to copy documents and correspondence that would serve as evidence, while Thomas had used his own military connections to verify the falsified reports that had been used to support stories about his death and Isabella's illness. The legal case they had been able to build had been strengthened by testimony from witnesses who had been willing to come forward once they understood that the conspiracy was being exposed and that their own participation could be forgiven in exchange for cooperation in bringing the primary architects of the deception to justice. Several of the military officials who had participated in falsifying reports about Thomas's death had been willing to testify about Judge Montgomery's role in arranging the conspiracy, while servants and business associates who had observed suspicious activities and conversations had provided additional evidence that supported the central accusations and helped establish the timeline and methods that had been used to maintain the deception. The public exposure of the Montgomery family's crimes had created one of the most significant scandals in Charleston's social history, involving not only the specific wrongs committed against Isabella and Thomas but also broader questions about the abuse of power by wealthy families who believed their social position gave them the right to manipulate and destroy other people's lives in service of their own interests. The scandal had resonated beyond Charleston to other southern cities where similar families wielded comparable influence, creating discussions about accountability and justice that threatened to undermine the social order that had protected the planter elite from consequences for their actions. Judge Montgomery's attempts to defend himself and minimize his responsibility for the conspiracy had been undermined by the extensive documentary evidence that Isabella and Thomas had assembled, while his efforts to discredit their testimony through attacks on their character and motivations had backfired by generating sympathy for victims who had suffered for years as a result of his calculated cruelty. The legal proceedings had been complicated by Judge Montgomery's connections and influence, but the strength of the evidence and the public attention the case had received had made it impossible for his allies to protect him without exposing themselves to similar scrutiny and potential consequences. The resolution of the legal case had provided not only vindication for Isabella and Thomas but also financial compensation that had helped them rebuild their lives while establishing precedents that would make it more difficult for other wealthy families to abuse their power in similar ways. Judge Montgomery had been forced to resign from his position, forfeit substantial portions of his wealth as compensation for damages, and face social ostracism that had destroyed the reputation and influence he had spent decades building. Charlotte Montgomery had faced similar consequences, losing her position in Charleston society and seeing her carefully cultivated network of social connections dissolve as former friends and associates distanced themselves from a family that had been exposed as willing to destroy innocent lives for personal advantage. The victory had been both personal and broader, providing Isabella and Thomas with the justice they had sought while also demonstrating that even the most powerful families could be held accountable for their actions when victims possessed the courage to fight back and the evidence to support their accusations. Their case had inspired other people who had been victims of similar abuse to come forward with their own stories, creating a movement for accountability that had challenged the assumption that wealth and social position provided immunity from consequences for criminal and unethical behavior. The marriage of Isabella and Thomas had taken place in a simple ceremony that emphasized their love and commitment rather than the social display that would have characterized Isabella's original wedding plans, reflecting their understanding that genuine happiness was based on authentic relationships rather than external validation and social approval. Their wedding had been attended by friends and supporters who had stood by them during their fight for justice, creating a celebration that honored both their personal victory and their contribution to broader social progress. Their life together had been built on foundations of trust, honesty, and mutual respect that had been strengthened by their shared experience of overcoming betrayal and fighting for justice against powerful opponents who had seemed invincible until their crimes were exposed to public scrutiny. The wealth Isabella had inherited, despite her father's attempts to control and manipulate it for his own purposes, had provided them with the resources needed to build a life that honored their values while supporting causes that helped other people who faced similar challenges and injustices. Sometimes the people who claim to love us the most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, but Isabella's story shows us that truth has a power that no amount of money or influence can ultimately defeat. Her courage to question what she had been told, to investigate when investigation seemed impossible, and to fight for justice even when fighting meant destroying everything she had been taught to value, reminds us that love and truth are worth any sacrifice. Have you ever had to choose between loyalty to family and loyalty to truth? Have you discovered that people you trusted completely were working against your happiness? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. And if you have suggestions for other historical tales that need to be told, please share them too. Your engagement helps me continue uncovering these powerful stories that remind us courage and love can overcome even the most sophisticated betrayals. Isabella and Thomas's triumph over the conspiracy that had stolen 3 years from their lives had established them not only as symbols of justice and authentic love but also as leaders in Charleston's evolving social landscape, where their example had inspired other people to question traditional assumptions about power, privilege, and the rights of individuals to make their own choices about marriage and life paths without interference from family members who prioritized financial and social considerations over personal happiness and genuine affection. Their story had become legendary throughout the South, demonstrating that even the most elaborate conspiracies could be exposed when victims possessed the courage to investigate and the determination to seek justice regardless of the personal costs and social obstacles they might face. The legal precedents established by their successful lawsuit against Judge Montgomery had created protections for other young people whose families might attempt to manipulate their relationships through deception, bribery, or coercion, while the financial penalties imposed on the Montgomery family had served as a warning to other wealthy families who might consider using their resources and influence to destroy people who threatened their interests or challenged their authority. The case had also led to reforms in military record-keeping and communication procedures that made it more difficult for civilian authorities to manipulate official reports for personal purposes, protecting service members from having their careers and reputations destroyed by people with political connections and questionable motivations. Isabella's personal transformation from grieving victim to determined advocate had been as remarkable as her romantic reunion with Thomas, as she had discovered capabilities and strengths that had been suppressed by a social system that discouraged women from taking active roles in legal, business, and political matters that were traditionally handled exclusively by men. Her successful investigation of the conspiracy against her had demonstrated intelligence, persistence, and strategic thinking that challenged conventional assumptions about women's abilities and opened opportunities for other women who possessed similar talents but had lacked role models and precedents that could justify their participation in activities that had previously been forbidden to them. The business interests Isabella had inherited had been managed more successfully under her direct oversight than they had ever been under her father's control, as she had applied ethical principles and genuine concern for employees' welfare that had created loyalty and productivity that translated into profits that exceeded anything the Montgomery enterprises had achieved through the exploitative practices that had characterized Judge Montgomery's approach to wealth accumulation. Isabella's success as a business leader had provided another example of women's capabilities that had helped change attitudes and create opportunities for other women who possessed entrepreneurial interests and business acumen. Thomas's reintegration into Charleston society had been facilitated by public sympathy for his suffering and admiration for his courage in supporting Isabella's fight for justice despite the personal risks he had faced from powerful enemies who had the resources to retaliate against people who threatened their interests. His military background and demonstrated integrity had made him valuable to business and political leaders who were seeking to reform Charleston's institutions and create more ethical approaches to governance and commerce that would serve broader community interests rather than just protecting established families' privileges and power. Their marriage had produced children who were raised with values that emphasized honesty, justice, and concern for others' welfare, creating a new generation that was prepared to continue the work of social reform and ethical leadership that their parents had begun through their fight against the conspiracy that had tried to destroy their love. The family's commitment to education, philanthropy, and social progress had helped transform Charleston from a city dominated by a small elite who maintained their power through deception and manipulation into a community where merit, character, and contribution to the common good were valued more highly than inherited wealth and social connections. The Charleston that emerged from the scandal surrounding the Montgomery family's exposure had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about the methods that had been used to maintain social order and economic hierarchy, leading to reforms that provided greater protection for individual rights and reduced opportunities for wealthy families to abuse their power without facing consequences for their actions. The changes had not been easy or rapid, but they had been irreversible, creating a foundation for continued progress that would benefit future generations of people who might otherwise have become victims of similar conspiracies and abuses. Isabella and Thomas's story had been preserved through letters, legal documents, and newspaper accounts that documented not only their personal struggle but also the broader social transformation that had resulted from their courage and determination to seek justice. Their correspondence during the years of their enforced separation had been published as a book that became widely read throughout the United States, inspiring other people who faced similar challenges while providing historical documentation of the methods that had been used to maintain social control through systematic deception and manipulation of information. The legacy of their fight for justice had extended far beyond their personal vindication to include contributions to legal reform, social progress, and the expansion of individual rights that had benefited countless other people who might otherwise have been victimized by powerful interests that believed their wealth and social position gave them the right to control other people's lives without consent or accountability. Their example had demonstrated that love, courage, and commitment to truth could overcome even the most sophisticated conspiracies when victims refused to accept injustice as inevitable and were willing to fight for their rights regardless of the obstacles they faced. The monument erected in Charleston's public square to honor Isabella and Thomas had become a symbol not only of their personal triumph but also of the broader principles they had defended through their struggle against the forces that had tried to destroy their happiness for the sake of protecting established interests and maintaining social hierarchy that benefited a few at the expense of many others' freedom and dignity. The inscription on the monument had captured the essence of their contribution, to Isabella and Thomas Harrison, who proved that love and truth are more powerful than wealth and deception, and whose courage transformed not only their own lives but the lives of all who seek justice in the face of those who would abuse their power. As I reflect on Isabella and Thomas's extraordinary journey from heartbreak to justice, I'm reminded that the most powerful conspiracies often crumble when faced with love that refuses to accept defeat and truth that will not stay buried. Their story shows us that sometimes our greatest betrayals come from those who claim to protect us, but also that courage and determination can expose even the most sophisticated deceptions. What strikes me most is how their fight for personal justice became a victory for everyone who has ever been told that powerful people cannot be held accountable for their actions. Isabella's courage to question what she had been told, to investigate when investigations seemed impossible, and to fight for truth even when truth threatened everything she had been taught to value, reminds us that authentic love requires authentic honesty, no matter what the cost. Her transformation from victim to victor proves that sometimes our greatest losses prepare us for our most meaningful victories, and that justice delayed is not always justice denied if we have the strength to keep fighting. What did you think of Isabella's incredible story? Have you ever discovered that people you trusted completely were working against your best interests? How did you find the courage to confront painful truths, and what did you learn about yourself in the process? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below, because these conversations help us understand why stories like this continue to resonate across the centuries. If Isabella's journey from betrayal to triumph has touched your heart and shown you that love and justice can overcome even the most powerful conspiracies, please subscribe to hear more tales of remarkable people who refuse to let others write their endings. Your support helps me continue preserving these stories that remind us courage, truth, and authentic love are the most powerful forces in human experience. I'm Eleanor, and I rescue stories that prove the human spirit can triumph over any betrayal, that love can survive any separation, and that truth will always find a way to emerge from even the darkest conspiracies. Isabella and Thomas's story shows us that sometimes what appears to be our ending is actually our beginning, and that the people who try to bury our dreams alive may actually be digging the foundation for our greatest victories.